Welcome to the Blockbusters and Birdwalks podcast. I am the curator, Garrett Chaffin-Quiray. Today we have a conversation with a friend.
This is Ed Rosa, bon vivant, professional simpleton, and you can check out my and our work on youtube.com at Toothless Richard Productions. This is Gateway Cinema, episode 15, Special Effects, and we're discussing the Fabulous Baron Munchausen.
Special effects really are the way that we use material in front of a camera, material inside of a camera, and material done in post-production to manipulate the realities of what the camera is dealing with so that the audience will eventually be tricked into believing what they see and what they hear. I know that can sound a little bit vague, but let me just also pinpoint what I believe is the truth. The greatest special effect that has ever been invented is the close-up. And that's just an in-camera trick of shifting a focal point to a plane that's very close to the lens and moving that camera right up to that spot, lighting it really, really well so we can dissect whatever has been placed in that focal plane.
Theoretically, like, makeup is a special effect.
It absolutely is.
Lighting is a special effect.
In the moment we live in now, people are turned on by computer-generated imagery, and that makes sense. It's pretty stimulating stuff. It can be so remarkable, in fact, that it looks artificial, fake, and unreal in a way that I don't find very satisfying often. The more effective use of special effects, to this guy at least, tends to be the more subtle things that are also more plain-spoken. The close-up, simple stunts, and the simple placement of a camera in such a way that it can transform the visual reality in front of that camera into something that seems real but is impossible. The clearest example I can come up with off the top of my head is just forced perspective. A tiny miniature of a gigantic building placed right in front of the camera with a set of lead characters who are standing somewhere in the background will look like they're actually in front of that gigantic building when they're in fact behind a very small building.
Right.
That's just a trick of how visual perception works through a dumb mechanical instrument called a camera. Another clear example is anytime you see one of your favorite performers go through an intense physical transformation. A very beautiful person becomes a very ugly person. A very ugly person becomes very beautiful. A blonde becomes a brunette. Somebody with blue eyes has brown. A person who has two arms is suddenly not having an arm. They're an amputee. These kinds of things are remarkable, and they're remarkable because they're tricks that we often engage with as spectators to acknowledge we like to be tricked.
Yeah.
And we like it so much, we don't want to be able to see through the trick. We want to have the illusion pass over us like it is the capital T truth inside of the story world. And if that happens, we're very happy.
Yeah. There. When you talk about physical transformations, one of the earliest examples I can think of something that I pretty much know how they must have done it, but it really blows my mind still to this day is the, I don't know if it's the original, but the Dr. Jeckyll and Mr. Hyde from like 1930, the one with like Friedrich March.
Yeah, he's terrific.
And in particular, because I'd wanted to see it forever, when he turns from Jeckyll, which I guess is actually supposed to be pronounced Jeckyll, into Hyde, and his face transforms into the hideous like countenance of Hyde, like right in front of the camera, and there's like no cuts. Like take Lon Chaney Jr. in the Wolfman, right? When he turns back into himself from the Wolfman, you get that thing where
you see parts of his body in isolation, or you see the stage timeline.
Right. Where you get like a little crossfade where they've shot him with a little less makeup in the same place, and then you get that sort of crossfade again with a little less makeup, right? And it's like, okay, well, this thing happens without any sort of like cuts,
obvious
like
trick,
that. Right. And I was like, at first, I was like, how the hell did they do that? That's so awesome. Now I with some thinking about it, it's like, well, clearly it's all makeup and lights and really taking advantage of the black and white film.
Yeah.
Because, I don't know, I think they were hitting it with black lights or something. So he had this makeup on where his face looked like normal. But then when they started hitting it with the different lights, it changed. It's just a remarkable special effect that, here we are damn near 100 years on and it still really holds up.
Well, that's a good segue to consider this movie you've chosen for us, The Fabulous Baron Munchausen. This is a Czech movie from 1962. I confess to never having heard of it. The only Munchausen that I was ever knowledgeable of is the Terry Gilliam from 1988, which I started to watch several times and could never complete, and that remains true to this day. I just never could quite bite down and chew on that thing. So to learn that there was an earlier one was extraordinary, and to then learn a little bit more about the backstory of this movie as a literary text from the 18th century turned into this movie from Czechoslovakia. Well, I point that out and connect it with what you were just saying, because this movie doesn't really ask us to accept that what we're seeing in it is true.
Right.
It goes to great pains to help us understand this is an artificial experience, that the cheats are very much in front of us. And even so, a few of the tricks are so ingenious and well done and kind of cheeky and silly that they are no doubt done cheaply, because I'm sure that was the word of the day. Make this fantasy movie of extraordinary travels and adventures, but do it cheaply, because we got no bread for this.
Yeah, I know it's Czechoslovakia. I can't imagine, that this cost, $150 million.
Inflation adjusted, right. That kind of resource was not available. So what can you do using the pro-filmic things that are in front of the lens, the things that are inside the camera and attached to the lens, and the stuff you can do later on through animation and the like? And what this ends up being, the Fabulous Baron Munchausen, to me, is it's a set of vignettes about a character with no psychological depth whatsoever, simply to overawe us across the 85 minutes or so of runtime, with the incidents of special effects work that make his adventures significant and interesting, and they're every one of them weird.
Yeah. Well, and it's like, it is a literary adaptation, and it's very storybook like. And in fact, some of the time with the hues that were used in the various shots, like, I don't know, like sometimes when it's like kind of like more yellow, it's almost like you're looking at a page in a book.
To speak the movie and its concrete story isn't going to be useful to recruit somebody to watch it.
Right. It's good, and the story is fun, but I find it's more valuable for kind of just the visual marvel
of what's in front of you.
Yeah.
But the story is about an Earthman who travels to the moon and encounters a group of 18th century types, let's just put it that way, and among them, including Cyrano de Bergerac, the poet, they're waiting for Baron Munchausen to show up. He does, and then he takes this moon man, who's actually an Earthman on the moon, on a set of adventures down on planet Earth, where they meet a girl, they both fall in love with her. This younger moon man astronaut, as we would call it today, gets the girl, and Munchausen's weird set of gifts at manipulating magic and responding to any threat without any trouble whatsoever, navigates it all, and happy ending. I've said nothing concrete, because there isn't really a concrete thing. And we're not really ever worried about bad things happening. It doesn't have any sense of dread or tragic outcomes.
Yeah, there's really no stakes, kind of.
None. It's just a series of misadventures. But there are also these built-up references that give rise to this, including the source, which I did a little research to discover is called Baron Munchausen's Narrative of His Marvelous Travels and Campaigns in Russia from 1785, which is loosely based on an actual guy who had various adventures in Central Europe during the 1700s, and he became famous as a storyteller. People would buy him drinks, and he would just embroider his life story and add details, and that became kind of this mode. A character whose ever-expanding life story becomes sort of fun. And that gets adapted on a stage. Eventually it becomes adapted into short films, and eventually into feature films, including this one.
It's kind of like a more whimsical Barry Lyndon. Kind of, right?
Yeah.
Less depressing.
Right. Because
sort of less critical.
Despite the fact that whole armies and navies are destroyed in this movie, and despite the fact whole civilizations appear to be blown up in this, nobody really ever dies.
No.
We don't linger over the possibility of fates being cut. It's just, there's new fun to be had.
I did have a little concern for the horses that they jumped off the cliff.
When our traveler, this Earthman, Tony, who goes to the moon, he stumbles into a spacecraft that's marked with Jules Verne's name. So it's there to think about this old writer of fantasy adventures, of science fiction adventures, establishing that mode. That's placed on screen in front of us.
And stylistically, it almost is kind of reminiscent of the way
the
Méliès film looks.
All of the surviving Méliès movies that I have seen, including A Trip to the Moon, do get defined by having actual live actors on artificial sets, which are plainly the proscenium stage, with all kinds of kind of crazy in-camera effects. Then on top of that, I have the impression of this is a Cold War movie. This is built behind the curtain.
Yeah.
This is a weird object for the Eastern Bloc countries in Czechoslovakia is the heart of this movie, where that bubbles up. Why would this happen then? So that's on my mind. But then I can see as I'm watching it, it yields to things which are no doubt going to be very familiar to you, and that's the whole Monty Python universe. The whole of their style of mashing together disparate elements, the impossibility of animation layered on top of 2D sets, which are plainly just sets.
Well, it's actually funny because, Terry Gilliam, unsurprisingly, has seen this film. But what's crazy is he didn't see it until he was already, in the process of making his Baron Munchausen.
Okay. In our time, this movie appears to be sort of a cultural foundation point for something like Pee-wee's Playhouse. The mix of just big, overlarge, animal-like objects, which are plainly in no way real, but interacting with our performers on stage, and they treat it seriously, like it is real. Then there's just this overlay because I'm a Star Wars kid. I can't help but always see Star Wars wherever I am. And this movie basically is Han, Luke, and Leia hanging out.
Right.
Some of the adventures they go on are exactly what Lucas planned for those characters when they get into the Death Star. It's exactly how certain sequences of that later, much more famous special effects laden movie, which becomes famous for its special effects, does seem to remember this. Now, Uncle George hasn't come to my house recently to say, hey, Garrett, my boy, this is something I enjoyed when I was a kid, and he may not be aware of it.
Right.
But I do know that the reputation of this filmmaker, Karel Zeman, is a large reputation. He's little known to most folks who don't speak some non-English language, and he's not well known for people who have no interest in other forms of animation and special effect than the likes of Disney. But for those who are, and I assume that at some point before George Lucas became synonymous with the mainstream of the American film industry, he was exposed to things, in particular because he went to film school beginning in the late 60s, when these Cold War era Eastern European movies would have had a slim but real distribution in some of the global city centers like Los Angeles and New York to share the good news of what else is happening in the world just as creative work goes, but also to shine a light on creatives who are standing up to the political authorities of their time behind the Eastern Bloc, behind the China Sea and what they're doing to try to stand up to the principles of individual magic, of being a person in a world that is often squashing individuals. And what greater individual can there be than a self-made sort of man of eternity, like Munchausen, who just bumps into things and solves dilemmas in all kinds of crazy ways. And then the technology, while limited, is applied in a rich and interesting way. Okay, what kinds of special effects do you see in this movie that draw your eye and cause you to recommend it to this situation of gateway cinema?
It seems to use both traditional animation as well as some stop motion in there. And I think there's a couple of shots where you get all three. You get live action, you get traditional animation, and stop motion animation, all in the same shot. The way the sets seem to be constructed, and the way our live action characters exist within them and move around in them. Like we were talking about earlier, it doesn't bother you that the artifice is so obvious. It's actually a selling point.
This is a color movie.
Yeah.
But it's mostly a black and white movie with tinted stock.
Right.
Defining certain movements or vignettes that we go through.
Right.
And it's pointed out, there's another reference, Pinocchio. That's important because at a certain point...
Yeah, they get swallowed by monsters.
They get swallowed by a leviathan.
Yeah.
And then that leviathan swims through various oceans on Earth and seas that are named for the color of the water. The Yellow Sea, everything's yellow.
Right,
the Red Sea, everything's red. The Black Sea, everything's black.
And he's like a big puppet or something. When we see him swimming around in the ocean, I don't even know. It's like South Park or something, where it's he's like a cardboard cutout or something. And then there's a part where after he gets harpooned or whatever, there's a trail of blood.
Some years ago, I was doing this exercise of trying to discover what was the earliest feature animation film that we've got. And there are several titles that show up when you Google search that topic, or you go to the wiki and you try to figure out what's going on.
I've had Snow White.
Well, there's a lot of lost films that...
Oh, yeah.
There's press that shows they existed because people saw them and commented on them, but they've been lost to time from the 20s.
Yeah. They say 90% of all silent movies were lost.
Correct. And so the earliest one that I think I could define at that time, it was, I think, called The Adventures of Prince Ahmed by Letty Reininger. It was a German movie, I think it was, and the form of animation that it is, it's puppet cutouts. So it's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of puppets that have been cut out in two-dimensional in construction paper or similar material and then photographed a frame at a time, 24 frames a second, to make a just over an hour-long feature film, which I have seen, and there are remarkable aspects of it. Among them is you have to embrace the totality of it being a completely 2D experience, and yet you can create depth by how you create dimensions of smaller or bigger puppet figures that are laid on top of one another and how far away they are from the camera eye. A lot of this movie is built on a similar principle. So there's a phrase, or rather, there's a technique, and that's compositing. That we composite material and we layer it deep.
Yeah, they offered that at my film school, and I did not take it. But interestingly enough, when at the student film festivals that I always attended, the ones done by the couple of people that were in compositing that none of the rest of us knew were typically the only ones that were good, except for mine.
The magic of the Rosa machine.
Right.
Well, what I mean to emphasize with that is that when we take the physical stock of film, and this is 62, so we're not talking about digital arts, we're talking about the physical stock of plastic film. The minimum manipulation is to flash it with light, and then you're going to cut those frames, and you're going to stick it together with other frames with tape. There's your movie, you know. But you could take that film stock, and you can expose it more than once, many times over. It's how historically you could get twins out of one actor. You just re-expose with that performer playing both parts on the same film strip, with the same lighting conditions and the same circumstance, and you use that strip more than once. This movie does that. It allows the composition of, let's say, an extraordinary long shot of people on horseback, which we see several times in this movie, done in silhouette. So they're little more than just black marks in the center of the frame. In the foreground is a painted backdrop that's probably just in somebody's physical notebook. And you put a camera over that very easily, very cheaply. You shoot the backdrop. You shoot the live actor who's 200 yards away from you on a horse. And then behind them is another hanging artifact that's just hand-drawn. And then you insert over the top of that some animation that you actually hand-draw. And you shoot the whole thing, 24 frames a second, click, 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 for almost no money at all, except for feeding your actors the once when you had to go feed the horses so that you could shoot them in silhouette.
Right. When
you layer all of that and create the composite image, you can do literally anything you want. Animators, of course, have been doing this for a long time, which is why I cite that movie, The Adventures of Prince Ahmed. It is cool that somebody figured out a way to create an entertainment that it doesn't involve people, but instead uses cutouts.
Yeah.
These filmmakers in Czechoslovakia had access to live performers, and they used them. But they're not often the most interesting thing that we're looking at. We're sometimes looking at drawings of forced perspective, two-dimensional space, with a horizon vanishing line to help us understand where our eyes are guided. And in the center of that spot, that's where the live actor is in a little pinhole. There's one interesting shot when I think it's Munchausen brings his hands together as if to make a circle or an iris, and the camera pushes into between his fingers to see what he's looking at.
Oh, yeah, because it's supposed to be like a spyglass.
Yeah, that he's using his hands to make one. And what we see is a drawn picture of a ship off in the distance. So it's cheeky and silly and fun, and it's cheap.
Yeah.
It just demands that the composite image is a composite of many, many parts that all by themselves, no one of them will sell you on anything. In fact, the sequences that are all live action are kind of flat and uninteresting. The transitional moments that are all just puppetry or just little bits of animation don't quite work. It's the layering of those things together which makes each seem strange, but interacting with the other. Animation and flat surfaces interacting with live people who plainly have facial expressions, recite dialogue, do the things that people do, and they're three-dimensional with a background that's not three-dimensional. It's weird.
Yeah.
But in moments, works really well.
It's kind of like also like Ralph Bakshi's, like his Lord of the Rings, or the way like like rotoscoping, is a thing that animators do, and like for his Lord of the Rings, for example, it's mostly animated, but then there's tons of like the battle scenes or like the orcs and stuff like that. They were actors that were shot and then just like animated over.
Right.
So it has this sort of heightened look.
The outline looks true, and then the details are as clear as you could afford to pay your animators the time allotted to create the innards of that outline. And it leads to unusual and strange effects. In this movie, there are a couple of shots where I think you're referring to horses getting injured and so on, or horses or people fall off cliffs, presumably to their death. And what we get is an image of, I assume, a photographed horse rider off in the distance, like I was referring to a moment ago. They get to a certain point in the scene as they're moving right to left or left to right. And then that rider on that horse is no longer actual photography and silhouette, but it becomes then a hand-drawn version of that thing falling to its doom. Mm-hmm. But that's a good way to use that rotoscoping or at least distant compositing techniques with simple animation to result in the destruction of an animal in this example. It doesn't actually result in the destruction of an animal.
Right.
And then, of course, there's lots of just weird costumes, which, again, is a sort of original special effect. What can you do to a person? Because we're endlessly willing to stare at people. What can you do to a person that will draw our eye? Well, you can dress them like clowns. You can dress them like generals or admirals, or you can dress them to ethnic stereotype, which happens repeatedly in this.
Yeah.
You can do all of these things that draws our eye. You can cast the movie with astonishing ugliness or beauty. And they managed that. The woman at the center of this, Princess Bianca, is a gorgeous blonde woman who seems to favor Tony. Munchausen wants to cuddle up to her. Again, it's that Luke, Han, and Leia sort of trilogy.
Right.
And it's basically a pretty chaste movie, although there is plenty of allusion to sexuality, and there's plenty of allusion to violence. Those things aren't really explored with any sort of depth or detail so that we can feel disgusted. I was going to watch this with my 13-year-old, and then I thought better of it because, well, this is going to require a patience with an older style movie that I don't know that she wants to offer me, and I don't want to burn that because I'll probably need to use it for something else. Make sure she sees. And then also, I don't think this is going to be the kind of curiosity that she's going to have and share with me, and so just leave it alone. Which is to say, this movie is extraordinarily dated to a time and a place, and that is the 1960s, where if you didn't have money, and I assume that most Czechoslovakian filmmakers working behind the Iron Curtain with whatever Czech money was available for creative projects had not much resource, how can you still make something that's interesting? Well, you can choose to not be conventional. You can choose to use a found literary source that brings pedigree. You can choose to use defined stage actors. You can choose to use odd set. You can choose to do all of those things. And in Fabulous Baron Munchausen, one way they create a lot of energy is they cut a lot. There are a lot of shots in this movie. And considering it's more than 60 years old, that's sort of amazing. People didn't get really into cutting fast unless they were Soviet in the 20s. Until somewhere after the 70s is generally my experience, when things accelerated rather rapidly. And so these little techniques, they cost you nothing. It just demands that you're going to have a coherent vision between the various technicians, the cinematographer, the editor, the production designer, the director, and the performers have to know there's no reason to act for the fences here. We're going to cut away from you. So just relax. Wear the dress and be handsome. That kind of a thing. And to the degree that the movie is successful, I think it really does capitalize on all of that. I keep track of the movies that I see, and I've mentioned this to you before, in my list of movies I've seen since I began having a coherent list. 1997 was the transition year. I'm up to something like 4,500 movies. I keep track of the title of the movie, the filmmaker, the year of release, the country of origin, whether it's live or animated, whether it's documentary or fiction, and I don't keep track of the minutes of length. That's a flaw. I had an earlier thing which I'd started in college, but my computer was stolen at a certain point, and so I lost the first 6 years of my record keeping, which continues to be a tragedy.
Yeah, you just have to go back and rewatch all of them now.
Well, I pulled that list up in preparation for coming to visit with you, because I wondered, how many Czechoslovakian movies have I seen?
Yeah, it can't be a lot. I don't think I've seen that many.
And because I thought for a moment, gosh, this could be the very first one. What a find! That's been one of the products of our friendship, is that you sometimes make me watch movies from outside of my cultural perspective.
Yeah, that's the best part about this, right? Yeah. Is getting turned on to shit you wouldn't necessarily have found on your own.
And this is one of those. I discovered that I think I've seen 3 Czech movies. And when I realized that, scanning my list, I could remember that the reason why I'd seen 2 Czech movies before this is when I lived in New York, I went to a film festival that was purposefully trying to look at behind the Iron Curtain movies by creatives working against the tide of compulsory submission to the state on weird little things that were peeking up around the edges and giving people who were in audience of those movies a little breath of possibility. And so a certain kind of filmmaker, this guy, Karel Zeman, decides, you know what? I want my people to celebrate the excitement of a bricoleur who shows up and just gives great conversation, and no problem seems going to defeat him. He's willing to engage with any trouble, and if necessary, he'll just float away in a galleon pulled by cardboard horses. And that's literally what happens in one scene.
Yeah.
He steps out of the moon and is brought down to Earth with a boat, with sail, through space, reversing the Méliès adventure of a trip to the moon.
Right.
Why? Because he wants to go to Turkey. I mean, it's senseless.
Yeah, but if the majority of the films that you are getting are like kitchen sink realism,
Yeah, what a breath of-
yeah, right, total escapist.
Yeah. So I feel like this does have its place. And anytime we have social crisis, and we've experienced this.
Is there any time we haven't?
Right. We're old enough to know that there have been dips in our adult lives where things have been a little bit more intense, let's say, and I think we're in one of those moments now where things are a bit more intense.
Yeah.
I think there's a gesture to look for fantasy and or science fiction stories that let us release from our present and just go gallivanting in some other world where it's always going to just be good news and sunshine.
Yeah, you need it.
This movie presents that. Its perspective, its themes, if it has themes you really want to interpret. I don't want to do a lot of work applying that kind of effort to this movie.
Right.
I don't think it's going to bear that kind of fruit, except to enjoy the wonder of what can you get away with and to make sure the movie's not too long.
Yeah, right.
Because it's not too long.
Yeah, it's an hour and 25 minutes.
And that's kind of a sweet spot. So much of our conventional special effects work today is trying to get you to make emotional purchase, and that what you're experiencing is true to the life of the characters in that story world. That if they're menaced by a monster, the monster is true, even though we know that it's not through the conventions of filmcraft. This movie doesn't make that choice. It doesn't make that bargain with us. It's more, how did they do it? Do you accept this as kind of a fun goof? You don't? Okay, just wait 2 minutes, and there's going to be another vignette of a new problem.
Right.
And maybe you'll like that one better. So in that way, it's like a short story collection.
Yeah.
Just move through the anthology, and you're going to get a new look that you might like a little.
Which
better.
is funny because I was going to add on to when I'm talking about engaging with something that's very short. It's the same thing if I know going into a movie that it's an anthology.
Yeah.
There's something almost like relaxing about that, knowing that, like, you know, like I said, even though I enjoy investing myself, that I'm only. You know, it's like it's going to go quicker or something, knowing that it's just going to be like 4 20-minute stories or whatever. You know,
and
instead
then what you're hoping, at least this is always my hope, is that they have laid out the stories in the appropriate order for my satisfaction. So it's going to build to a conclusion I like the best,
right?
Rather than disappoint me the most as my aftertaste,
right.
This movie ends up with our two young lovers being lost in space with gunpowder in a physical tower from an old castle that turns into the missile that takes them to the moon. Heteronormativity rules. This is Blockbusters and Birdwalks. I'm the curator, Garrett Chaffin-Quiray.
I'm Ed Rosa, bon vivant and professional simpleton.
Boop boobity doo.